It was 3 in the morning when everything I had built for 40 years began to come apart. The study was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in the hours before Fajr prayer, when the city holds its breath and even the wind seems to lose its nerve. I was sitting at my desk, surrounded by walls of books I had read dozens of times, commentaries I had written myself, fatwas I had issued that had changed the course of real human lives. The lamp on my desk cast a circle of amber light across a page I had opened perhaps 100 times before. But that night I could not read it. I just sat there, and my hands were trembling, and I did not know why. My name is Reza Shirazi. For most of my life, people called me Ayatollah. I want you to understand what that meant, not as a title, not as a word, but as a total architecture of existence. I was 61 years old when I issued my last fatwa against a house church in the northwest of Iran. I was 53 when I signed an exile order that sent a Christian pastor's family across the Turkish border in the middle of winter. I was 44 when I first publicly condemned the name of Jesus as a corruption, a distortion, a tool of Western imperialism dressed in the robes of false divinity. I believed all of it. I want to be honest with you about that, because the story I'm about to tell you won't make sense if you think I was ever secretly soft. I was not soft. I was iron. I was the system. Before I go any further, if this story is already reaching something inside you, if you feel like maybe God led you here today, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel and leave a like. It costs you nothing, and it means that more people like you will find their way to testimonies like mine. Please, do it now, and then let me keep talking. I was born in Qom, the city of seminaries, the city where the air itself smells like old ink and rosewater, and the dust of centuries of religious scholarship. My father was a cleric. My grandfather was a cleric. The trajectory of my life was decided before I could read. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it with precision, because it matters. I was not a man who wandered into Islam. I was a man who was constructed by it, brick by brick, from the age of 4. By the time I was 12, I had memorized large portions of the Quran. By 17, I was studying at Hausa, the seminary in Qom, living in a small room that smelled of mildew and shared a courtyard with 40 other young men who all believed exactly what I believed. We woke before dawn. We prayed. We studied. We debated. We prayed again. The structure of the day was itself a kind of theology. The hours organized around submission, around the certainty that we were on the right side of God. I was not just a good student. I was exceptional. My teachers said so openly, which in that environment was unusual. Praise was rationed carefully like water in a dry season. When Ayatollah Montazeri's senior assistant told me at the age of 23 that I had the sharpest legal mind he had seen in a decade, I felt something I can only describe as a cold, clean fire in my chest. Not pride exactly. Confirmation. The sense that the life I was living was the one I was supposed to live. That feeling would sustain me for nearly 5 more decades before it finally ran out. I want to tell you about the Hausa, because if you don't understand what that place does to a man, you won't understand what it costs to leave its logic behind. The seminary was not simply a school, it was a total world. You woke in the dark before the city was awake, and the cold of the stone floor came through your slippers, and the sound of other young men already moving in the corridor was the first thing you heard each morning. You prayed. You ate in a common room where the food was plain. Bread, white cheese, sometimes a thin soup that smelled of dried herbs and old pots. You sat in circles with your teachers for hours, and you argued, rigorously without mercy, with a precision that most academic institutions in the world could not match. The Islamic legal tradition is not a simple thing. It is a vast, interlocking structure of jurisprudence built across 14 centuries by some of the most careful minds in human history. I loved it. I want to be clear about that. I loved the rigor of it. I loved the feeling of a question precisely answered. I loved the sensation of a legal argument locking into place the way a key turns in a well-made lock. That love was real. It was not pretense. What I did not understand then, what I could not have understood from inside the system, was that I had confused the map for the territory. The law is a map. A beautiful, intricate, detailed map. But it is not the land. I had memorized the map so completely that I had forgotten there was anything beneath it. I had stopped asking whether the map corresponded to something real. In the Hausa, that question was not asked. To ask it was to imply that perhaps the entire structure rested on something other than absolute divine authority, and that implication was the beginning of heresy. So we didn't ask. I didn't ask. For decades. My closest friend in those years was a young man named Mahmoud, who came from Isfahan and had a laugh that filled whatever room he was in. Large and sudden, like something he couldn't quite contain. We argued late into the nights about jurisprudence, about history, about the great classical debates between legal schools. We drank tea from small glasses, and the steam rose between us and the smell of the kerosene heater in the corner of his room, mixed with the dusty smell of the books stacked on every wall. Mahmoud became a cleric of some distinction himself eventually. We lost contact after my conversion became known. He has not reached out. I don't blame him. I understand the position he is in, and I pray for him, and I hope that someday the thing that happened to me might happen to him too. Not the loss, but the finding. After the revolution, everything accelerated. The Islamic Republic was new and loud and hungry for men like me, men who had deep scholarly credentials and also the temperament for enforcement. I had both. I rose quickly. By my mid-30s, I was sitting on councils that made real decisions. By my 40s, I was issuing religious opinions that government officials cited in policy documents. By my 50s, I was one of a small group of clerics whose approval or disapproval could make or break careers. Politicians called me before announcing legislation. Intelligence officials consulted me about matters I was not supposed to know existed. I was not elected. I was not appointed by any formal process. I had simply accumulated authority the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a river, slowly, imperceptibly, until one day the riverbed itself is changed. I need to be honest about what that power felt like, because honesty about this is part of my repentance. Power felt like rightness. When a room full of men fell silent because I had spoken, when a government official leaned forward to catch my words, when my written opinion arrived on a minister's desk and the minister adjusted his policy accordingly, all of that felt from the inside like confirmation, like God affirming that I was correctly positioned. I understand now that it was nothing of the kind. I was a man in a system that rewarded certain qualities, and I had those qualities, and the reward felt divine because I had been trained from childhood to interpret everything through a theological frame. Good things that happened to me were God's blessing. Authority I accumulated was God's endorsement. When you are inside a system that is that total, you don't question it. You breathe it. It is the air. The work against Christians was not something I did reluctantly. I want to say that again because it matters for what comes later. I was not a man secretly sympathetic to the underground churches, doing just enough to satisfy my superiors while privately leaving people alone. I was a true believer in what I was doing. When I received reports of house churches operating in Tehran or Tabriz or Mashhad, I treated those reports with the same seriousness that a cardiologist treats reports of a dangerous infection. I believed the faith of these people was a threat, to the Republic, yes, but more fundamentally to their own souls. I thought I was protecting them from a lie. I thought I was protecting the truth. That is what a man tells himself when he is doing things he will one day have to reckon with. He tells himself he is on the right side of something cosmic. And if the system around him confirms that story every single day, it becomes very difficult to hear anything else. My wife, Mariam, was a patient and intelligent woman who understood the life she had married into. We had 3 sons. We had a home in Qom and an apartment in Tehran, and a small plot of land in the hills north of the city where we went in summer when the heat in the valley became brutal. I am telling you about these things not to boast, but because I want you to understand the specific weight of what I eventually lost. When you lose something you never valued, the loss is clean. When you lose something that was your entire identity, your entire world, the loss is a different category of thing altogether. My trouble began, of all places, with a text, not a vision, not a dream, not a miraculous voice in the night. At least, not at first. It began with a single verse from the Gospel of John, which I had read before only in the context of refutation. We studied the Gospels in the seminary, you understand, but we studied them the way a prosecutor studies the opposing counsel's evidence, looking for weakness, looking for contradiction, looking for the place where the argument falls apart. I had read John chapter 14, verse 6 dozens of times. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I had a standard response to it memorized. I had given lectures dismantling it. I knew exactly what it meant and exactly why it was wrong. But that February night, at 3 a.m, I opened my desk drawer and found a small New Testament that had been confiscated from a young man my office had detained 6 months earlier. I don't know why I had kept it. My assistant should have disposed of it. Perhaps I intended to use it for reference. Perhaps something else kept it there. I opened it without thinking much about it, the way you reach for a glass of water without deciding to, and it fell open to John 14. And I read those words again. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And something happened that I cannot fully explain even now, years later, with the benefit of reflection and distance, and a faith that has cost me nearly everything. The words did not feel like an argument. They felt like a door. I sat very still. The lamp hummed. Outside, a car passed slowly on the wet street below, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling of my study. I could hear my own breathing. I read the verse again, and again, and a thought came to me. Not a theological thought, not an academic thought, but something more like a question from a very deep place. What if this is simply true? Not as a claim to be refuted, not as a Western construction to be deconstructed. What if this man, this Jesus, was telling the absolute truth, and I have spent my entire life organizing the world around the assumption that he was not? I closed the book. I set it down. I went to bed. I told myself it was fatigue. I was 71 years old. I had been working 16-hour days for the past month, and the mind, when exhausted, does strange things. I had seen students go through crises of doubt. I knew the shape of it. I thought I was immune to it. I was not. For 3 weeks after that night, I said nothing to anyone. But the question did not leave. It followed me into the mosque, into my meetings, into my lectures. It sat next to me at the dinner table when Miriam talked about our grandchildren and the smell of rice and saffron rose from the pot on the stove. It was there when I pressed my forehead to the prayer rug 5 times a day and tried to fill my mind with Arabic words I had recited 10,000 times. The words felt different now. Not wrong exactly. I could not have said they were wrong. But hollow in a way they had never been hollow before. Like a room where the furniture is still in place but the people have left. I began to read. Carefully, secretly. I had enough authority that no one questioned what I did in my private study. I ordered books through channels that could not be easily traced. I read the Gospels in full for the first time in my life, not as a prosecutor but as a man. I read them slowly, in the early mornings before prayer, with a cup of black tea cooling beside me and the city still dark outside my window. I read Matthew, and I read Luke, and I read Mark, and I read John again. All of John, slowly, verse by verse. And the more I read, the more disturbed I became. Not because the text was weak, as I had always told my students, but because it was not weak at all. I found myself stopping again and again at small details that had nothing to do with the big theological questions I had been trained to argue about. Jesus touching a leper. Jesus eating with the wrong people at the wrong table. Jesus stopping in a crowd because a sick woman had touched the hem of his robe, and turning to find her not to condemn her, but to say that her faith had healed her. These were not the details of a manufactured theological document. They were the details of a man. A specific, particular, real man who moved through the world with a consistency that was unlike anything I had encountered in any other religious text. The Buddha in his texts is often luminous and removed, a sage teaching from above. Muhammad in the Hadith is forceful and political, a prophet building a community. But Jesus in the Gospels is something else. He is terribly, almost dangerously present. He shows up in specific places at specific times and deals with specific people in ways that feel too particular to be invented, too idiosyncratic, too strange. A man inventing a prophet would not include the detail about Jesus sleeping through a storm in the back of a boat. A man inventing a savior would not record the moment in Gethsemane when Jesus asked if the cup could be taken from him. These details read like the testimony of people who were there and could not forget what they had seen even if they had wanted to. I had a specific day. I remember it clearly. A gray Tuesday in March, rain on the window of my study, and the distant sound of a muezzin from the mosque 3 streets away, when I sat with the 8th chapter of John for almost 4 hours. The woman caught in adultery, the Pharisees bringing her to Jesus to trap him, the trap elegant in its construction. If he says to stone her, he contradicts his reputation for mercy. If he says to let her go, he violates the law. And Jesus does neither. He bends down and writes in the dirt. We don't know what he writes, the text doesn't tell us. And then he says the sentence that scattered every man in that crowd. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And then he bends back down and keeps writing. He doesn't watch them leave. He doesn't make a speech. He goes back to writing in the dirt. I sat with that scene for a long time. As a man who had spent 40 years making legal judgments about other people's faith and conduct, I understood the Pharisees in that story with a specificity that was uncomfortable. I had been them. I had used the law as a weapon dressed in the clothing of righteousness. I had asked the same kind of elegant trapping questions to people brought before my councils, and Jesus dismantled the trap not by arguing against the law, but by asking the men holding the law to look at themselves first. It was the most devastating legal move I had ever encountered, and it was not a move, it was a truth. That was the difference. The Pharisees were performing. Jesus was not performing. He was the most unperforming person in the history of religious literature, and that quality, that absolute absence of theater, was for me the most convincing thing about him. Jesus of Nazareth was not the passive, distorted figure of my training. He was not a failed prophet whose message had been corrupted by Paul and Constantine and centuries of Western politics. He was something else entirely. He spoke with an authority that I recognized. I had spent my life studying authority, and I knew what it looked like when a man spoke from outside himself versus when a man spoke from within. Jesus spoke as though the words originated inside him, as though truth were not something he had learned, but something he was. That distinction for a man like me was not small, it was everything. I want to pause here for a moment because I'm thinking about you. Yes, you, watching this right now. I don't know where in the world you are. I wonder sometimes, when I share this story, who is on the other side of the screen? Are you in America? In Germany? In Iran? Watching this on a VPN with your door locked? The way I once read the Gospels at 3 in the morning with my study door locked? Are you in Brazil? In Nigeria? In South Korea? Wherever you are, I want you to know that the loneliness I felt in that room, that specific loneliness of a man who is surrounded by a world that makes complete sense to everyone else but has stopped making sense to him. That loneliness is not unique to me. If you feel it, you are not alone. Tell me where you're watching from. Leave a comment. I read them. I want to know. Now. Let me tell you about the night it became impossible to deny. It was April. 3 months after that first night with the confiscated New Testament. I had been living a double life inside my own mind, conducting my public duties with the same precision I always had, issuing opinions, meeting with officials, delivering Friday sermons, all while carrying this growing internal fracture that I told no one about. Not Mariam, not my oldest son Hassan, who was himself becoming a cleric and who trusted me the way a man trusts the ground under his feet. No one. I was alone with it in a way I had never been alone with anything. That April night I was reading the account of the crucifixion. I had read it before, of course. We addressed it explicitly in our refutations of Christianity. The Islamic position is that Jesus did not die on the cross, that another was substituted in his place, that the crucifixion as described is a theological error. I had argued this position publicly dozens of times. But that night, reading the account in Luke, the detail of it, the texture of it, the way the narrative slows down and becomes almost unbearably specific in its grief. Something broke open in me that I cannot describe in any language I know except this. I felt it. Not intellectually. In my body. In my chest. The image of a man hanging in the darkness, asking why God had forsaken him, and then choosing, consciously, deliberately, in full possession of himself, to give his life for something beyond himself. I set the book down and I pressed my palms flat against my desk and I said out loud, alone in my study at 11 at night with the lamp burning and the sound of the city faint outside. I said, "If this is true, then everything I have done is wrong." And I sat with that sentence for a long time. It filled the room. It was the most dangerous sentence I had ever spoken, because I knew what it meant. A man in my position who said those words publicly would not simply lose his career. He would lose his freedom. He might lose his life. I did not pray in Arabic that night. For the first time in more than 50 years, I did not say the words I had said every night of my life. Instead, I said something that had no formal theological status in any tradition I had ever studied. I said, into the quiet of that room, "Jesus, if you are what you say you are, if you are the way and the truth and the life, then I need to know. I cannot stay in this middle place. I cannot keep living divided. Show me. Please. Show me something real." I don't know what I expected. A voice, maybe. A light. Something I could measure or categorize. What happened instead was quieter than that, and more devastating than any vision would have been. The room simply became, there is no other word for it, full. Not of sound or light, but of presence. A presence that was not threatening, but was absolutely unlike anything I'd ever encountered in 50 years of prayer. It was personal. It was directed at me specifically, at Reza Shirazi, not at the Ayatollah, not at the scholar, but at the man underneath all of that. The frightened, lonely, aging man who had spent his entire life building walls and calling them faith. And in that presence, for the first time in my life, I felt something I had no name for in any Islamic theological text I had ever read. I felt known, completely known, every hidden corner of me, every act I was not proud of, every letter of every exile order I had ever signed, all of it visible, all of it held, and not condemned, held. I wept. I want to be honest about that. A 71-year-old Ayatollah, who had never wept in public in his adult life, sat at his desk in the middle of the night and wept like a child. And when it was over, when the weeping stopped and I lifted my face and wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, I knew. Not with the kind of knowing that requires more argument, with the kind of knowing that exists underneath argument. He was real. Jesus was real. And he had just walked into my study. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. I continued my public duties. I gave sermons. I met with officials. I ate meals with my family. And inside, I was a completely different man, living inside the old man's body, wearing the old man's robes, speaking the old man's words while something new and terrifying and alive grew in the center of me. I read everything about Jesus that I could find. I found, through channels I will not describe in detail, contact with a small network of Iranian Christian believers, people who had been doing exactly what I had spent decades trying to eliminate. When one of the men in that network eventually agreed to meet me, he did not know who I was at first. We met in a tea shop near the bazaar, at a small table in the corner, the smell of cardamom and black tea thick in the air, the sound of vendors and traffic outside the open door. His name was Dariush. He was perhaps 45 years old, an ordinary man, an engineer by training, with careful eyes. When I told him my name and my title, he went completely still. "You," he said quietly. "You are Shirazi." "Yes," I said. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at me. "You signed the order that sent my brother-in-law out of the country." The tea in my cup had gone cold. I could hear the clink of glasses from the counter across the room. I said, "I know. I am sorry. I am here because I need to tell you that I know now that I was wrong. I am here because I have met Jesus, and I don't know what to do with that." Darius did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was steady in a way that shamed me. He said, "Neither did we. For a long time. And then we decided to follow him anyway." I cannot tell you how much that sentence cost him to say to the man across the table. I cannot tell you how much it cost me to receive it. But I can tell you that in that moment, in that tea shop that smelled of cardamom and wet stone and exhaust from the street outside, I understood something about forgiveness that no Islamic juridical text had ever taught me. Forgiveness was not a legal transaction. It was a choice a person made in their body, in real time, with the full knowledge of what had been done to them. It was the hardest thing I had ever witnessed. Darius connected me eventually to a small underground fellowship, 12, sometimes 15 people, meeting in different apartments each week, rotating locations to avoid detection. The first time I attended, I sat in a corner and said almost nothing. The apartment was small, the walls close, the smell of dinner still faint from the kitchen. Someone had cooked something with turmeric and onion. A woman named Fatimeh, who was perhaps 30 years old, led them in a song I did not know. The voices were quiet by necessity, kept low out of caution, but there was something in those voices that I had not heard in 50 years of Friday prayers. Joy, not duty, not correctness, joy. Something small and warm lived in that room, and I recognized it even though I had never seen it before, the way you recognize sunlight through your eyelids, even when your eyes are closed. I met with Darius privately several more times over the following months. He was patient with me in a way I did not deserve. He answered my questions, and I had dozens of them, academic, theological, precise questions from a man who had spent his life doing nothing but asking and answering questions, and he answered them without trying to win an argument. He was simply interested in the truth, and I had not met many people like that, including in my own circles. One evening, sitting in a park as dusk came down and the lamps flickered on and the smell of cut grass mixed with diesel from the road, he said something that I have thought about nearly every day since. He said, "Reza, you spent 40 years making the case against Jesus. I think you are actually very well qualified to make the case for him." The underground fellowship taught me things that no seminary had taught me. It taught me what faith looks like when it has no institutional protection, when it cannot call on police or legal frameworks or cultural prestige for reinforcement, when the only thing holding a community together is the conviction that the person they are gathering around is real and present and worth the risk. I had spent my career in religion that was backed by the full weight of a nation-state. The mosques, the courts, the councils, the intelligence services, all of it organized in support of a particular religious vision. These 12 or 15 people met in rotating apartments with their voices kept low, singing songs that would have gotten them arrested if heard through the wrong window, and they were more alive in their faith than anyone I had encountered in 50 years of official religion. That contradiction sat in me like a stone and did not move. One of the members of the fellowship was a young woman named Parisa, perhaps 28 years old, who had converted 5 years earlier after her brother became a believer while studying in Canada. She worked as a nurse, and she had a directness about her that reminded me, oddly, of the best students I had taught, the ones who asked the questions that other students were afraid to ask. One evening she looked at me across the small room where we were gathered and said without any particular drama, "What do you do with the guilt for the things you did before?" She wasn't accusatory. She was genuinely asking. She had her own version of the question from her own life, but she asked it of me because she knew my specific history. I sat with the question for a moment. The room was quiet. Outside, someone was playing music on a floor above us, something with a daft drum and a melodic line I couldn't quite make out. I said, "I don't know yet. I'm learning." And she nodded as though that was the correct answer, and went back to listening to the passage being read. But the question lived with me. It still does. What do you do with guilt of that magnitude? You cannot undo exile orders. You cannot give back the years that families spent separated. You cannot unmake the fear you caused in people who were doing nothing more than meeting to worship a person they believed had died for them. You cannot subtract yourself from the system you helped build. What you can do, what I am learning, slowly, is possible, is bring it to the only place where it can actually be held. Not processed away, not dissolved, held. Jesus does not pretend the things I did were small. He knows they were not small. But he holds them in a way that does not crush me under their weight, and I don't know how to explain that except to say that it is the most specific and most personal mercy I have ever encountered. It is not a general theological statement. It is a transaction that happens in real time when I bring the specific face or the specific name before him and say, I did this. I was responsible for this. And he says, I know. I was there. And I took it with me. That is not a comfortable theology. It is a true one. I was baptized in a private home 9 months after that night in my study. There were 8 people present. The woman who held the bowl of water had tears running down her face the entire time. I said the words, I confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And they were the truest words I had ever spoken in my life. More true than any fatwa. More true than any sermon. More true than my own name. I was 72 years old, standing in a stranger's bathroom in Tehran, dripping water on a tile floor in a circle of people who had every reason in the world to distrust me, and I was more certain of anything than I had ever been certain of anything. Then the consequences came. They always come. Darius had warned me they would. The community of believers I had found understood risk, in a way that people in free countries sometimes cannot fully imagine. They had already paid prices. Darius's brother-in-law was still in Turkey. 2 other members of that small fellowship had spent time in Evin prison. They knew exactly what following Jesus could cost, and they followed him anyway. Their courage was, for me, its own kind of testimony. My first difficulty came not from the government but from my own family. My son Hassan found out first. I do not know exactly how, perhaps through a conversation I had not been careful enough about. Perhaps through someone in the network who made a mistake. He came to my apartment in Tehran on a Thursday afternoon when Mariam was visiting her sister, and he stood in the doorway of my study and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger exactly, something beneath anger, something that looked like grief. Father, he said, tell me it isn't true. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and caught the dust motes in the air between us. I could hear the traffic outside. I said, Hassan, sit down. He did not sit down. He said, you know what will happen. You know what they will do. Not just to you, to all of us, to my family, to my career, to everything. I know, I said. Then how can you? Hassan. I stopped him. I tried to choose my words carefully. I said, I spent 50 years telling other men what was true, and I was wrong. I know now that I was wrong, and I cannot live as though I don't know that. I cannot, not even for you. He left without speaking. The door closed behind him, and the sound of the traffic seemed very loud for a moment and then settled back to its ordinary volume. I sat alone in my study and looked at my hands and prayed, in the new way that was still strange and intimate and terrifying, and I asked Jesus to protect my son, not from the truth, from the consequences of the truth, which is a distinction a father understands in a way a theologian might not. The formal consequences came 4 months later. It became known, I still do not know the exact pathway by which it became known, that a senior cleric had converted. The word used was apostasy. I knew the legal implications of that word in the system I had helped to build. I knew them precisely. I had applied them to other people. My title was stripped in a meeting I was not invited to attend. My government consultancy was terminated. My access to official channels was revoked. My sons, Hassan and his 2 brothers, were put under informal pressure that was never stated explicitly, but was absolutely clear in its message. Men who had called me for advice for 20 years stopped calling. The phone simply went quiet. There is a specific quality to that silence. The silence of people who once needed you now pretending you do not exist. That I can only describe as a physical sensation, a particular kind of cold. Mariam. Let me tell you about Mariam, because she is the part of this story I find hardest to speak about even now. She knew before Hassan did. I told her myself one night in our kitchen in calm, when the kettle was boiling and the window above the sink was fogged with steam and the smell of tea filled the small room. I told her everything. The night with the New Testament, the months of reading, the meeting with Darius, the fellowship, the baptism. I told her all of it while she stood very still with her hands wrapped around her own cup and looked at the fogged window rather than at me. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Reza, were you ever happy? Before?" The question surprised me. I thought about it honestly. I said, "I was certain. I don't know if that's the same thing." She was quiet again. Then, "Are you happy now?" I said, "I am something I don't have a word for in any language I know. I am more frightened than I have ever been and more at rest. At the same time. Both." She nodded slowly. She set her cup down and she walked out of the kitchen, and I heard her in the other room, and I did not know what she would decide. I want to be honest with you. I did not know. We had been married for 46 years, and I did not know what my wife would choose. That is what honesty about conversion sometimes looks like. It is not clean. It is not simple. It does not resolve quickly. Miriam did not convert immediately. She is still on her own journey, a journey I respect and do not try to accelerate, because I know what it means to move at the speed you are able to move and not faster. But she did not leave. She stayed. On the night my title was officially revoked and the news spread through the circles we had moved in for decades, she made tea and sat down next to me and put her hand over mine on the kitchen table and said, in a voice that was very tired and very steady, "Well, you were always too certain about everything. Maybe this will be good for you." And I laughed, genuinely laughed. For the first time in months, it was the best thing she could have said. We left Iran 2 years after that night in my study. The decision was not dramatic. There was no chase, no border crossing in darkness, no sirens. It was a managed, quiet, careful departure through a pathway that I will not detail here for the safety of people who helped us. We arrived in Germany in early spring, when the trees were just beginning to open and the air smelled of cold soil and rain and something clean that I did not recognize at first as simply the smell of a country that had not seen us before. We came with 2 suitcases and the New Testament that had started everything, the one confiscated from that young man whose name I never knew. I still have it. The cover is cracked and the pages are soft from handling, and there is a small water stain on the 3rd chapter of John that was already there when I found it in my desk drawer. I think about that young man sometimes. I pray for him. I hope he knows. Germany was strange in ways I had not anticipated. I had traveled internationally before, to conferences, to meetings, always as a figure of authority, always with the specific gravity of my title creating a particular social space around me wherever I went. Now I was simply an old Iranian man in a small apartment in Frankfurt, with poor German and no title, and no council meetings to attend, and nowhere that needed my opinion. The freedom of that was something I had to learn to receive, because my whole life I had experienced freedom as something dangerous. Freedom from obligation was dissolution. Freedom from authority was chaos. That is what the system had taught me. What I was learning, slowly and with considerable difficulty, was that there is another kind of freedom. Not freedom from. Freedom for. Freedom towards something rather than away from something. That is the freedom Jesus talks about. And I am still, at 74 years old, learning what it means in the practical texture of an ordinary day. The Christian community that received us in Germany was a small Iranian diaspora church in Frankfurt, meeting in a rented room above a grocery store that smelled of cardboard boxes and wood floor cleaner. They sang Persian songs with German words mixed in, and they welcomed us with a warmth that I had not earned and that I received with a humility that was entirely new to me. An elderly woman named Sohila, who had left Iran decades before us, held both my hands when she met me and said, in Persian, "Brother, we prayed for you. We prayed for your kind for a long time." I did not know what to say to that. I still don't, fully. The idea that people I had never met were praying for the conversion of men like me, men who were actively working against them, is something I continue to sit with. The pastor of that small community was a man named Kamran, about 50 years old, who had the particular kind of gentleness that does not come from softness, but from having been through something that required everything he had. He told me he had spent 8 months in Evin prison in his late 20s before he left Iran. He said it simply, without theater, the way you mention a fact about your own biography that you have learned to carry without drama. He said, "I don't tell you this to make you feel guilty. I tell you because I want you to know that I understand what the system does to people, from both sides. You from the side of enforcement, me from the side of the cell. And Jesus somehow found both of us. That is the only thing that makes sense of any of it." We sat in his small office that smelled of instant coffee and old carpet, the sound of the city outside the window, and neither of us spoke for a while, and it was one of the most complete conversations I have ever had. I began slowly to build a different kind of life. I learned German badly, and then slightly less badly. I walked along the main river in the mornings, watching the light on the water, gray and silver in winter, green and gold in summer. I met with young Iranian asylum seekers who came to the church, and I listened to their stories with ears that had been rearranged by what I had experienced. I taught sometimes, not theology exactly, but history. The history I had lived from the inside, the history of a system that used God as an instrument of power. I taught it with as much honesty as I could manage about my own role in it. That honesty was not comfortable. It was necessary. My relationship with Hassan is complicated and continuing. He has not followed me into faith. He is angry in a way that moves slowly, like a river moving around a large stone. He doesn't crash into the stone. He flows around it, and the stone and the river both continue to exist. We speak occasionally by phone. I do not try to argue him into anything. I simply tell him when he asks what I have found. And I pray for him with a consistency and a love that I am honestly not sure I could have generated out of my own strength. That love comes from somewhere outside me. I know where it comes from. What I know now, after all of it, after the quiet study and the confiscated New Testament and the tears at midnight and the tea shop and the baptism and the stripping of the title and the suitcases and the Frankfurt church that smelled of cardboard and the elderly woman with her certain hands. What I know now is this. I spent 40 years as a man who had mistaken the architecture of religion for the presence of God. I built a very elaborate, very intelligent, very powerful structure around a room that I had never actually entered. And Jesus, this Jesus who I condemned and dismissed and argued against for decades, Jesus walked through the wall of that structure one night in February and stood in that room and waited for me. He did not shout. He did not argue. He simply waited. With a patience that still unmakes me when I think about it, a patience that exceeded mine by an infinite margin. I want to say something to the person watching this who is where I was, who is intelligent and trained and certain and secretly tired, who has built something that looks like faith, but feels, in the private hours, like a locked room. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not capable of forcing another person into that room. But I am going to tell you what I found there. The presence of a person. Not a system. Not a text. Not a legal framework or a political theology or a set of enforceable obligations. A person. Jesus. Who knew my name, my real name, not my title, before I ever spoke it. Who held in one hand every act I was not proud of, and in the other hand a future I could not have imagined for myself. Who asked nothing from me in that moment except that I simply stop pretending I had not heard him knock. He is real. I know this the way I know I am breathing. With my whole body, not just my mind, with the part of me that was always deeper than my arguments. After 40 years of building walls around a name I thought I could contain, 40 years of fatwas and exile orders and public condemnations, Jesus turned out to be precisely what he said he was. The way, the truth, the life. Not one option among many. The one thing that was true all the way down. I could not go back now even if I wanted to. Not because I am trapped. Because you cannot unknow something that is written on you this deeply. The Reza Shirazi who sat in that meeting room issuing fatwas against house churches, he is gone. I am still Reza. I am still Iranian. I still love Persian poetry and the smell of rosewater and the sound of the call to prayer in the early morning, which is a beautiful sound regardless of everything. But I am a different kind of Reza now. The kind that wakes in the morning and speaks to Jesus the way you speak to someone in the room with you. Because he is in the room with me. He has been every morning since that February night. He will be tomorrow morning. That is not a hope. That is the most certain thing I own. There are things I carry that I will carry for the rest of my life. The names of men whose lives I made harder. The face of Darius in that tea shop when he recognized who I was. The silence on my phone in the weeks after my title was revoked. The look on Hassan's face in the doorway of my study. I do not pretend these things are resolved. Forgiveness, I have learned, is not a transaction that clears an account. It is a direction you choose to walk in every day for the rest of your life. Jesus walks it with me. That does not make it light. It makes it possible. I am 74 years old. I live in a small apartment in Frankfurt with Mariam, who drinks tea in the mornings and watches the street below and asks me sometimes about the stories in the Gospels with a curiosity she has never explained and that I have learned not to rush. My German is still poor. I walk along the river most mornings, in the cold or in the warmth depending on the season, and I pray out loud in Persian when the path is empty, and the water runs beside me and the trees overhead do whatever trees do. And I am a man who has lost everything he built and found something he never could have built himself. This is the testimony I kept silent about for 3 years. The testimony I told no one, not my wife, not my sons, not my handlers, not the men who had trusted my authority for decades. Because what happened in that study did not fit inside any framework I had spent my life building. I know now why it didn't fit. The framework was not big enough. The truth was larger than the structure I had made to contain it. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you, truly. I don't take lightly that you stayed. If something in this testimony moved something in you, if you feel the pull of something you cannot fully name, please don't ignore that, and please subscribe to this channel. We share testimonies here because we believe every story like mine is a light that can reach someone sitting alone in a locked room at 3 in the morning. Someone who is certain and tired and secretly listening. You never know whose study you are walking into when you share a story. Jesus did not wait for me to be ready. He came anyway. These testimonies go the same way, out into the world, looking for whoever needs to hear them. Help us send them further. Subscribe, share. And wherever you are tonight, know that you are not alone.